I'm going to start this review with what I think is an incredibly glowing endorsement. When the end credits rolled, I could see couples, friends, people of all ages turning to one another and saying things like, I think so and so was in the wrong, or so and so is so real for that decision. And it put a huge smile on my face because I truly believe one of the greatest strengths of a good film is its ability to spark conversation and to get people to take the what ifs of the film world and transplant them onto their own lives, bringing a little imagination into the everyday. In this film, the drama absolutely does that. And I'm going to mention up front that I'm going to spoil this movie because it's very difficult to discuss it in any meaningful way without doing so. A24 rightfully kept the central secret out of their whole marketing material, and that secret is, of course, what Zendaya's character has been keeping from everyone her whole life, a revelation that she suddenly makes to her friends and to her fiance, played by Robert Pattinson, just days before they were about to be married. If you have not seen this film, please stop watching this video. It is absolutely imperative that you go into the drama not knowing what Zendaya did because it informs the entire feeling of everything that follows. All right, so with that out of the way, let's talk about the drama. I truly had no idea what to expect going into this film. When a film hinges on a character revealing their deepest, darkest secret, that secret faces a bit of a balancing act. It can only be so dark, and yet it has to be dark enough to justify being withheld from the marketing material and compelling enough to drive the rest of the film forward. So when it's revealed that Zendaya's character planned a school shooting as a teenager but did not go through with it, I immediately thought, that is maybe the perfect way to ride the line between the two poles. Too dark and the film becomes unbelievable or collapses under its own weight. Not dark enough and there's no real conversation to be had. This film lands exactly where it needs to. The reason this balancing act is so difficult is that darkness in fiction operates on two competing axes simultaneously. The first is believability. The more extreme the secret, the harder it becomes to accept that this seemingly normal, functional person standing in front of us could have it buried inside of them. And the moment an audience stops believing in the character, the film loses its grip entirely. Now, the second axis is stakes. The secret has to feel genuinely destabilizing because if the audience's reaction is essentially, well, that's not so bad, then the entire emotional architecture of the film collapses. The darker you go to raise the stakes, the more you risk snapping the audience's believability. But the safer you play it to preserve believability, the more you risk deflating the stakes. And this film puts its secret right out front and center with nowhere to hide. The whole room has to gasp at the same time, and then the whole room has to keep watching for a whole other hour because they genuinely don't know how they feel about what they just learned. That's kind of an extraordinarily narrow target to hit, which is part of why Borgli's instinct to land on something as specific as an abandoned mass shooting plan, not a completed act, but an intention that was never carried out, feels so precise. It's dark enough to be genuinely unsettling and human enough to leave room for empathy. The rest of the film becomes the drama surrounding that revelation, particularly as Robert Pattinson's character grapples with the idea that he may be about to marry someone he doesn't fully know. One of the film's greatest strengths is that it doesn't balloon into something farcical or unbelievable. It stays fairly grounded, and even as things go off the rails approaching the climax at the wedding, they never go so far off the rails that we've left the universe of the film that it established at the start. Now, extracting all of the juice from a high concept what if scenario is a tricky task for any filmmaker, especially when the entire film hinges on a single revelation. Kristofer Borgli knocked it out of the park with the drama, in my opinion. The film raises so many questions about where we locate our empathy, about the culture of mass shootings in the United States, about the way we hold images of other people, and how those images shift when new information comes to light. The concept of revealing your deepest, darkest secret to a loved one before marriage, only to have it permanently cloud how they see you, is genuinely kind of chilling. And so it's no surprise then that much of this film plays out like a mixture of cringe comedy and psychological horror. Most what if your partner revealed blank before the wedding movies go really high concept. They reveal a secret agent, a superhero, a time traveler, an alien, something that introduces an entirely new genre logic into the film and essentially hijacks the story into action or fantasy. The secret becomes the plot engine, the relationship takes a backseat to the mythology. And what Christopher Borgli does here is something far rarer and, from a writing perspective, far more difficult. He goes high stakes instead. The Secret isn't a world building device. It doesn't open a portal to a different kind of movie. It stays completely inside the emotional and psychological reality that the film established in the first 10 minutes. The what if he's asking isn't what if your partner had a double life? It's what if your partner was once capable of something terrible, and what does it mean for who they are now? That's not a plot question, it's a human question. And human questions are genuinely harder to sustain across a feature film because you can't resolve them with a third act action sequence or a magical fix. You have to just sort of sit in them. It feels similar to that film Force Majeure from, I don't know, 10 years ago or something. I recommend people watch that one. What I find fascinating about this from a writing standpoint is how little the film actually needs to do once the premise is established. There are really no twists, no reversals, no hidden second secret waiting in the wings, which is something that I half expected. The film essentially says, here's the thing, now watch these people react to the thing, and yet it never feels thin or underplotted because the premise itself is doing enormous dramatic heavy lifting. It forces every scene, every conversation to carry the weight of that revelation. That's the mark of a truly great premise. It doesn't need to be complicated because the right question, asked at the right moment, generates its own kind of propulsion. And Christopher Borgli found one of those questions. They don't come along very often. From a filmmaking perspective, Borgli employs a technique where certain scenes play out entirely inside of a character's head, a visualization of what they imagine is happening with someone else. After Zendaya reveals her secret, for instance, we see Robert Pattinson's character absent from their apartment. And then we get a little bit of a vision in her head of him talking to his best friend about fleeing the country, calling the police, calling her a psychopath. These glimpses into the inner psychology of the characters allow you to connect with them on a bit of a different level, and they're one of the more inventive tools that the film actually uses. Now, the fun thing about this premise, and Christopher Borgli is absolutely a filmmaker who gravitates toward incredible premises after this and Dream Scenario, is that everyone is going to have a different reaction to it. Putting myself in the headspace of Pattinson's character, I found myself siding with the belief that Zendaya's character is a changed person, that the psychological hole that she was in as a teenager doesn't represent who she is at 30. But then you have the opposition, Alana Haim's character, whose cousin was paralyzed by a school shooter, who simply cannot see Zendaya as anything other than what she once was. That impulse is fairly universal. You learn something about someone and you can't look at them the same way ever again. It's like if a close friend suddenly revealed something sexual about themselves, maybe something that isn't even dirty or out of the ordinary, and yet something about knowing it just sort of stays with you. You can't unknow it. I really do think this is some of Zendaya and Robert Pattinson's best work, which feels like something I say every time either one of them is in a new movie, but I absolutely mean it. Pattinson, in particular, is leaning into the buffoonery of his character, and he has gotten remarkably good at playing the buffoon. There's something else I appreciate. The stakes ramp up in a believable way. Using the approaching wedding as the film's destination is a pretty brilliant structural choice because by the time it arrives, it becomes a bit of a pressure cooker. And during the wedding sequence itself, my entire theater must have gasped at least 6 or 7 times. In terms of movie going experiences, this one is fairly memorable for how audible the reactions were the entire time. You got the sense that everyone in the room was cringing at exactly the same moment, particularly when Robert Pattinson is bumbling through his whole speech and he mentions how good their sex life is in front of everyone. You just wanted to crawl into the screen and shut him up. But I want to return to the heart of what this film is really about, the concept of forgiveness and how difficult it could be to see someone clearly once you've learned something about them. The film is smart in how it uses school shootings as a hot button pressure point. It does so in a way that's approachable rather than exploitative. There's an offhand remark that Zendaya's character makes while describing her teenage mindset that I found genuinely fascinating, and I kind of wish the film had explored a little bit further. The idea that there's an online mystique and aesthetic around gun violence and the tortured teenager archetype that is relatively new to human experience. The flashbacks of young Emma going through the stages of planning the shooting, getting bullied by classmates, practicing with the gun, and ultimately being rattled out of it amount to one of the more interesting depictions of how close these things can get to actually happening every single day. At one point, Pattinson's character says something to Alana Haim's character that functions as the film's underlying thesis. We walk by people all the time who most likely came incredibly close to committing a mass shooting and never said a word about it. That's the slow burning horror underneath all of this. Because we know this thing about Zendaya's character, we spend the rest of the film slightly on edge. The film's implication that any human being's capacity for violence is one bad day away is the kind of idea you'd readily associate with something like Joker, but transplanting it into a bit of a rom com aesthetic is a genuinely neat and unsettling choice. Now, I love these kinds of films. They're high concept but grounded. They don't come along very often, and when they do, they can either go very badly or very well. This is an example of one that I think goes very well, one that holds on to the romantic heart at its center, and it holds on to the hope that we can recognize one another on a deeper psychological level, and doesn't let buzzwords like mass shooting permanently overwhelm its logic and compassion. Now, some dramatic liberties have to be taken, of course. There's a scene where Zendaya is cutting fruit to make a smoothie in front of Robert Pattinson, and he's terrified that she's going to stab him. Or there's the inner fantasy sequence where Robert Pattinson sees Zendaya holding guns while he's flipping through a photo book. These are things that make the film visually intense and engaging. And Kristofer Borgli really does ride the line well, staying grounded while effectively saying something meaningful about human nature and relationships. Also, I have to admit it, I genuinely got a little choked up at the final scene. After all hell breaks loose at the wedding and these two people seem utterly doomed, they find themselves in a diner near their apartment and do a bit of role playing, essentially meeting each other again for the first time. It's beautiful narrative symmetry. The film opens with them suggesting, maybe we should start over, and the film closes with them actually doing it. I found it genuinely moving. What makes the moral and ethical terrain of this film so genuinely difficult to navigate and so rich to talk about in a YouTube video is that the film doesn't give you a villain. It gives you a person, and there's a meaningful difference here because Emma didn't do anything. That's the first and most disorienting fact that the film keeps returning you to. There was no shooting, there were no victims, there is no crime. What exists is an intention that was formed, it was entertained, it was planned out in some detail, and then abandoned. Abandoned, importantly, not because Emma was caught or something, but because reality intervened in the form of an actual shooting. She didn't just walk away from the plan, she walked toward the opposite of it, channeling whatever was driving her into activism, into advocacy, into a life that has been one of compassion and growth. And yet, the plan existed. The gun was tested. The intent was real. How much does the road not taken count? How much does intention matter in the absence of action? These aren't questions that the film answers. And they shouldn't be, because they're questions that don't have clean answers in real life either. And then layer on top of that the specific cultural weight of school shootings in America, which is where the film becomes genuinely pretty brave. There's almost no subject more charged or emotionally loaded in contemporary American life like mass shootings or school shootings. By using a gateway character who is sympathetic, funny, warm, clearly loved by the people around her, Borgli puts the audience in an impossible position. Because you could hold two true things at once, that Emma is a good person, and that what she once contemplated was monstrous. The film is asking whether those two things can coexist inside a single human being, and whether the people who love her are allowed to decide that they can't. Alana Haim's character isn't wrong. Her cousin is in a wheelchair, and Pattinson's character isn't wrong either when he argues that we may walk past people every single day who once stood where Emma stood and stepped away from the edge. The film's genius is that it builds a world in which everyone is right and no one is wrong, and people involved still have to make a decision about their lives. Would you marry this person? Would you stay their friend? Could you look at them the same way at Christmas dinner or at a birthday party or on an ordinary Tuesday? There is no right answer. There is only the answer that you would give and what that answer says about you. That the film could hold all of that inside of what is essentially a wedding cringe dramedy is, I think, a bit of a minor miracle. Kristofer Borgli is shooting up no pun intended, my list of filmmakers to watch very closely. After Dream Scenario and now this, he's building a filmography of remarkable premises, the kind of ideas that sound undeniable on paper but require real craft to make accessible to a wide audience, the kind that could be pitched to a studio like A24 and made into a film with two beautiful movie stars without losing what made the concept special in the first place. That feels kind of rare, and this film deserves to be celebrated for it, and, if for nothing else, for getting people talking about it from the moment that the credits start to roll. But you know what? I want to know what you guys thought of the drama. Please, I hope for the love of God you didn't watch this whole thing without seeing the movie. So if you did see the movie, which I hope is all of you, head down to the comments and let me know what you thought of this film. I didn't really touch on a lot of the negatives because I was kind of rambling a whole lot. I had a lot of positive things to say. I have a few negative things to say, but honestly, it's not really worth going over. I really love this. It's one of my favorite films of the year so far. Let me know if you agree down in the comments. And when you're done with that, don't forget to like this video, hit the subscribe button, and hit the bell to be notified when new videos come out on this very channel. And then when you're done with that, go follow me over on Letterboxd so you can see what I'm watching when I'm watching it. And then when you're done with that, go check out my podcast where I talk about movies with people who love movies. And if you want to be a guest on the show, go ahead and send an email down to this email down below and we'll get you on the show. Anyway, that's going to do it for me. The drama. Hope you liked it. I'll see you all next time.